First, I'm troubled when my opponent, at least three times, and my opponent is a fellow pastor, three times he keeps saying that he's not dogmatic on this issue we're debating tonight. In other words, he doesn't think what we're debating, what we are disagreeing on, is of importance, it sounds like. If I'm wrong, please correct me. The fact is, we are preaching two different gospels about the kingdom of God here. And we know from Paul what that means if one of us is preaching another gospel. So when you keep saying I'm not dogmatic about this, I'm very troubled by that. So let me address the destruction of Jerusalem. In your opening, you brought up Luke 21. In Luke's version of events, he mentions Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and then he says he will recognize that its desolation has come near. I think that's a parallel to the abomination of desolation, parallel in Mark, in Matthew. And in Mark, it's interesting because in Mark 13, verse 14, it says, when you see him, in other words, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to, and that's obviously a reference to the wicked prince, the little horn, the beast, the Antichrist of the visions of Daniel. Daniel chapters, as we know, 9, 11, and 12. And he is standing in the temple, and then the destruction of the temple. So it's not just an event. It sounds from Daniel's interpretation that there is no Antichrist. Yes, we agree Jesus is talking about the buildings, the temple and the buildings surrounding it at that time, which was later destroyed in AD 70, of course. Daniel keeps assuming wrongly that Jesus knew when this would happen, when Jesus clearly said he did not know the time or the seasons of his parousia. I believe, or like many, that Jesus is incorporating the idea of two or more temples on the same site as the one temple at the time. And we have a good example for that in Haggai chapter 2. If you read there that prophecy, that vision, I believe, of the future, it says in Haggai 2, verse 3, this temple in its former glory, meaning a different temple than the one Haggai had in front of him, and this house will be filled with glory, though it will be a new building, as the prophecy goes. And the latter glory, says Haggai, of this house in Haggai 2, verse 9, is to be a brand new building for the house in question that has long since been destroyed. So there is an example parallel to this, where a prophet will be speaking of something in front of them or people in front of them, but with that incorporates not necessarily that time or that era or age. Now, the word parousia, Daniel said we agree on the word parousia. No, we do not. I have Jesus talking about his parousia. He's answering the question, by the way, in Matthew 24, verse 3. Hey, Jesus, when is your parousia and the end of the age? So it's about his coming. It's not just a coming in judgment. So we totally disagree. I'm not sure why you say we agree, Daniel. You can explain. The phrase the end of the age as used by Matthew, in Matthew's own gospel, if you go to Matthew chapter 13, there is a parable called the parable of the weeds. The word parousia is used in Matthew 13, according to my count, at least 3 times. And that parable is obviously about the coming kingdom, because it says that when Jesus' parousia happens, his coming, he will send out his angels, they will gather us, and then we will shine like the sun in the kingdom of God. And obviously there it's a physical return of Jesus to gather physically Christians. And every other word, by the way, used for parousia, other words like epiphania, the lexical dictionary meaning is always of a physical coming. I'd like to know in the cross-examination, to what lexicon or dictionary is Daniel getting that parousia does not mean a physical coming? Let's see, the Great Tribulation. Yes, Christians in general, we will suffer tribulation and trials in this life. Yes, but this is a specific type of tribulation. It says a final, short, agonizing time, according to the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 13. And Jesus also is obviously referencing Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 12. 3 times the vision there says at that time, 3 times In other words, at that time of the Great Tribulation and immediately followed, Daniel 12 is the resurrection of the dead, unless my opponent is giving that a non literal meaning as well, the resurrection of the dead in Daniel 12. What I believe John later calls the first resurrection in Revelation 20. Let me deal with Matthew 24, verse 34. If you look up the lexical meaning of the word translated generation, you'll find that it's one of the most indefinite terms in New Testament Greek, according to your lexicon or dictionary. So it can mean different things, but obviously context is king here. So in the context of the events described by Jesus throughout his prophecy, I believe, of still in the future of Matthew 24, a more natural reading of the word yenea, generation, would be this present evil age, meaning human society as a whole. It is used in this way by Paul in Galatians 1:4, evil an adulterous generation demands a sign. Also in Matthew 12, and you'll see the Hebrew parallelism, as some call it, in Matthew, where it says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And the very next verse, 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So this follows a common Hebrew idiom expressing the same thought using different words or metaphors, as well as Jesus' often use of hyperbolic language to bring attention and urgency to his teachings. That's why when Jesus says that the kingdom is near, that the kingdom is at hand, he goes on to say in Matthew 24 about the fig tree, it's right at the door. This is what I call standard operating prophetic language. If you go back to the prophets before Jesus, almost a millennia before Jesus, prophets like Joel, Zephaniah, Ezekiel, guess what? They talk about the day of the Lord, which we believe is the parousia, the coming of Messiah, to establish the kingdom of God, near. It's around the corner. Joel 1:15, for the day of the Lord is near. Zephaniah 1:14, the great day of the Lord is near and hastening fast. So it's always at hand, it's always near, but near, of course, in English doesn't mean here. And then one last thing, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. So in Matthew, later in Matthew 26, in the trial of Jesus by the Sanhedrin, you will see that Jesus talks about his coming. Again, the point here is Jesus even answering the question of the disciples. It doesn't sound like it from Daniel's perspective, because again, they're asking a very specific question. Your parousia, not just some kind of impersonal judgment upon the land of Israel alone. By the way, it's not that localized. Jesus says that all the peoples of the world or the society, all the nations will see him. And then one last thing, Matthew 24, verse 29, immediately after happens the parousia, which is connected to the resurrection, I believe, as many of us believe. End of the age results in our resurrection. And it's all about our vindication, by the way. 70 AD was simply a judgment, as my opponent understands it. It's not a vindication. It's a scattering of believers, not a gathering of believers. So it's totally the reverse of the prophecies of not only Jesus, but all the Old Testament prophets. Thank you.